Hey, what's up? It's a beautiful Sunday here. Have been doing some spring cleaning, I guess, out here in the garage. My beautiful wife's been kind enough to help me out. I'm doing most of the thinking and the staring, trying to figure out what stays and what goes. She's hauling the heavy trash cans. We were just having some lunch when she looked at me and said, "You know, this old husband, there just aren't enough getting started in TIG welding videos." So I figured I'd volunteer my 2 cents. Now, don't hang up the phone just yet, or get too excited. This won't be your classic step-by-step how-to. At least I don't expect it to be anyway. There's already a lot of great content out there on the subject from people, frankly, more qualified than I am. What I'd like to do is perhaps give you a slightly different take on the matter, my take. Share some insights I think I've picked up over the years that hopefully shed some more light, more differenter light. I'm not going to get into settings, machine adjustments, tungsten types, shapes, or flavors. I'm not going to talk about torches or regulators. This is sort of one step before all of that. And really, I suppose, just about the big picture. Just about melting stuff. Now, before we get into this, allow me just 2 quick thoughts here. First, I'm not a welder. So there's that. I've been doing this a long time, but I only play one here on YouTube. Although I do think you can teach yourself how to get metal to stick, that won't make you a welder. Like you won't get that job welding pipe on an offshore oil rig by showing them a resume full of videos you've watched. At least I hope you wouldn't anyway. Not that I'm not rooting for you. Second, let's have a little heart-to-heart. As we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. Once you think you've taught yourself how to weld, promise me that I won't be on the highway driving my family out to the lake and you pull in front of me towing 4 tons of cinder blocks and your buddy's bedroom set with a bumper sticker that reads, "Tot taught me how to weld this trailer." Making a bench, some planter stands maybe, or fixing a hole in your lawnmower deck, that's one thing. But if you want to build a mile-high catwalk for your local mall, weld broken elevator cables, or your neighbor's iron lung, just do me a solid and think long and hard about it, all right? Now, I'm not saying that you can't. Anyone hear me say that you can't? I'm not saying that you can't. Once word gets out that you weld, no one's going to know better than you if you're actually up for it. And getting it over your head is easier than you might think. The snot-nosed kid with the loud stereo from down the street shows up with a cracked rim asking you to weld it? Come on, man, it's just a tiny crack losing a little bit of air, and these things cost me a year's allowance. Or your one neighbor who seems like a sweetheart but never makes eye contact and gives you that nagging feeling they keep their childhood pets in their freezer. They show up with a mower blade broken in 2. "Can you please help me out? I'm this close to finishing, then I'll buy a new one, I swear." Well, my suggestion is to just walk away. That $10 or hard-to-resist offer to cryogenically store your cat just isn't worth it. And I know, cryogenic storage ain't cheap, you don't have to tell me. But resist the urge. You'll sleep better at night, and no one will die. At least not because of you anyway. Let's get started. Now this is the business end. And in addition to a TIG torch, you'll also need a welder. Learning to TIG weld gets a heck of a lot easier if you actually have one. Now, as you may know, I'm using an HTP 221. Now, this is a relatively new addition. I don't have a ton of hours on it, but so far I'm over the moon. But if you're just getting into this, just getting into TIG, and you just kind of want to try it out, have some fun on the weekend, the 221 is likely a bigger hammer than you need. Again, those sort of recommendations are hard to make. I don't know what you plan to do, what your budget is. But if you just want to learn, a basic machine can be had for almost any price, really. Now, we'll only be talking DC welding here, on steel probably, at average amperages. Not too low, not too high. And in that range, especially in DC, and just to feel the process out, really any TIG welder will do. Heck, if you already have a DC stick welder, you can get a TIG conversion kit, like with a torch or regulator, a power lug, that kind of stuff, and be up and running for, I don't really know, but probably under a couple $100. Now that would just be scratch start. Not the most convenient way to weld, but it does work. People have been TIG welding that way since the Middle Ages. Now the sensible recommendation I feel to make is to buy something of quality. A name brand that won't cause you a lot of headaches. Me personally, I snuck up on TIG over the years. Started with a DC conversion kit, then a DC-only machine, then an AC-DC machine. The more I was welding TIG, the more I liked it, the more I wanted to explore other features and functionality, or found problems with the equipment I had. So it seemed like I started cheap, but really I just kind of upgraded slowly over the years and probably spent 10 times more than I would have if I would have just bought the machine I wanted outright. And although I think that's reasonable, like a reasonable recommendation. I know it's not always easy to justify, but maybe you got a friend with a TIG welder, a maker space. You could try paying your local welder for some one-on-one time, get some hours on a machine, see what you think about it, and then make a decision. But you do you. Just remember, any TIG welder is better than no TIG welder. If you want a TIG weld, that is. Anyway, none of that's really relevant to what we're talking about here. I just wanted to show you what I'm using. Let's get down to business. I'm going to go through my hit list in no particular order because I'm too lazy to think this video through ahead of time. If I jump around a bit, bear with me. I'd like to start this off with the torch pointing straight down, perpendicular at the work. No magic angles for now. And it'll be facing off with a very brave piece of mild steel. Now the steel's been cleaned with an angle grinder and wiped down. You hear a lot about having to clean your material for TIG welding, and there's a very good reason for that. The reason is your material's got to be clean. You can't get away with TIG what you might be able to with a stick welder and say some 6013. But don't take my word for it. Try and experiment yourself. Try TIG welding on some really dirty, rusty metal. See what your weld looks like. Though, be honest with me, you've already tried that experiment, haven't you? This material is grounded, of course, with the TIG welder's ground clamp. Make sure your clamp is clean, okay, clean-ish, and in relatively good condition. Like frayed, broken cable connections or just two wire strands holding on for dear life. Dirty, pitted clamp faces just won't make for a good time. Probably not safe either. Now, unfortunately, this view is a lot closer than you'll likely be seeing in real life. You'll have to be very attentive. So get some cheaters in your helmet if you need them, wear reading glasses, or get a helmet like mine with a 10 times digital zoom function. I mean, you can't weld what you can't see, right? Here, everything is already set up. You can find all this other information out there already, but I have the right tungsten in there, it's sharpened to a point. My argon is set to the right flow rate. I've got the right cup size on for the weld I'm about to do. I'm also holding a gap of about 1/8 of an inch, about 3 millimeters. And I've got my helmet on and wearing proper clothing. FYI, TIG puts out a lot of UV. Don't weld in short sleeves, a tank top, your sexy short shorts, lest, the cancer. At this point, we're golden. Everything's set up, we're comfortable, ready to push the button or stomp on the pedal. If you're new to this is where everything starts to go downhill. So what are we looking at? Well, the welder is pumping current through our electrode and the electricity is jumping that 1/8 inch gap. To do that, it's ionized the argon gas and created a plasma. The arc you're looking at is plasma. And plasma, fun fact, is pretty toasty. It's hot enough to melt steel. And in fact, all that heat has quickly created a molten weld puddle. When you're looking at a TIG arc or any welding arc, when you're staring at it on the edge of hyperventilating, trying to figure out what to do next, ignore the bright arc. Ignore the sparks and the sound of screaming children in the background. What you want to do is keep a hawk eye on that weld puddle. Is it big? Is it small? Did it take too long to form? The only thing of any importance is that puddle. Under your hood, you should make it the center of your universe. When all is said and done, that puddle is what will solidify into the weld bead you really want to put on Instagram. If it doesn't look right now, while it's molten, it's really not going to look any better once it's firmed up. Now in this shot, that weld puddle looks like it's moving around a heck of a lot. And keep in mind, this is like 10 times magnification easy. I mean, maybe I've got my flow rate up a little too high, but looking at it first person, it looks just like a regular old TIG puddle from here. But we'll get back to this in a second. For now, notice my torch, again, is perpendicular to the work. I'm pointing it straight down. Let's see what it looks like if we put the torch, say, at a 45-degree angle. Well, how about that? Looks pretty much the same, doesn't it? It's roundish, it's liquid, puddled up just as fast. So why all the hubbub about keeping the proper torch angle? In welding, the heat goes where you point the torch. And of course, with any electric welding, I guess, the current will jump the gap. So even if you had your torch laying on its side, given enough amps, your base metal will melt. But you're losing most of that heat. Puddle is likely much bigger than it needs to be. You're barbecuing the part you want to weld and likely not getting the penetration you think. Bottom line, point your electrode where you want your heat. So ideally for a flat weld, that'd be perpendicular. I know, don't jump out of your chair just yet. Vertical or overhead, it's still the same principle. But in a case like this, you'll have gravity to deal with. On a flat weld, gravity is in your favor. Vertical or overhead, you've got gravity fighting against you. So the torch angle changes a bit, but let's not go there just yet. If you've got a flat weld, the torch would want to be vertical. If it's, say, a lap joint, it's still flat, but vertical is going to be a little awkward for you. You want the heat in that joint so you're perpendicular, sort of at that 45-degree line with the torch. You want to get that weld bead in the lap joint. But say you're trying to weld a thinner piece on there. Now you've got two thicknesses to deal with. The geometry is still the same as that last one, but if you keep your torch, in this case a 45, you'll likely melt back the thin material long before you start to puddle the base metal. So here you might be maybe a little bit more vertical. In this case, the difference is so dramatic you may even be near vertical. But you'll see all of that quickly in the puddle. Watch the puddle, you see it start racing up the one part, just adjust your torch angle. Let's go back to our flat weld. If you try to weld this with the torch pointing straight down into the weld area, you'll run into a couple of problems. First, it's hard to see what you're doing. The cup here is blocking my view. So naturally what you do is just kind of peek under there, tip the torch back a little bit. I think the official number is, 15, 20 degrees, something like that. But it's really just so you can see what you're doing. Perpendicular drives the heat right down into the weld joint, but that's not much help if you can't see where you're welding. The other problem, of course, is that sooner or later you're going to want to get some filler material in there. It's already crowded enough as it is. If you hadn't have leaned your torch back a little bit, you really wouldn't be able to see what's going on. I don't know yet if I'm going to get into adding filler material in this video. Maybe if this is well received, we'll do a part 2. I'd kind of like to go through some exercises to just help develop a feel for sort of the rudimentary torch motion before you start adding complications like filler wire. But maybe. So starting off is usually not that bad. Pumped, primed, and ready to go. You're in your kung fu stance with your 15 degrees and maybe your filler rod, and you're sitting comfortable. What I found is the problems usually start to creep in as you progress along your weld. You start off great, but it just starts to fall apart as you move 3, 4, 5, 6 inches away from where you started. So as simple as it sounds, moving the torch is what I'd like to get into next. Instead of trying to explain how to move the torch, let me see if I can illustrate how not to move the torch. I think that way, once you know what to avoid, then you can do whatever else you'd like, however you want to do it. But then don't come crying to me if it doesn't. So if you're built anything like me, your arms will be attached to your body at your shoulders. So if you plant your keister in a chair and move only your arm, your torch hand will want to move in a circle, or like an arc, more or less. You ever try writing a letter on typing paper? There are no lines to follow, and your sentences might start to droop down the page the farther they get away from you, the farther you reach your arm. And the same thing goes for your hand. If you plant the heel of your hand, keep a death grip on that torch, and try to TIG weld with just the range of motion like your wrist, hand, and fingers might provide, you're going to have trouble welding straight lines. It might work fine for short welds, 2, 3 inches maybe, depending how big your hands are. But after that, your welds will either go off the rails, or you'll have to suddenly reposition to catch up. Suddenly and TIG welding don't go well together. What you should aim for is keeping a light but steady hand, not planting all your weight in one spot. Now granted, that's easier said than done, but to prep for it, warm up your muscle memory, it's good to take a few dry runs. Move through the length of the weld you plan to do without lighting the torch. Make sure you have the range of motion you think you have. If your dry run starts out well, but you end up twisting yourself into a pretzel, move yourself around a bit, or reposition the work if you can. Often you'll see people welding towards themselves, at a bit of an angle maybe. It's exactly what I did here, simply because that puts the work in your natural range of motion. Now if I were to light up here, 16, 20 inches away from my eyes, I'm not going to really be able to see what's going on. So I'd be in here pretty close with my helmet, in this case watching the line or trying to keep a consistent gap from the edge. Maybe it's inside of a fillet and I don't want to clip one of the two edges. So since I'm in so close, then it's my whole torso sort of translating across the weld. And my weight will shift, the longer the weld bead is. Again, you don't need too tight of a grip on the torch. You don't want to cut off the argon flow. Maybe hold it as tight as you'd hold a pen or a big marker. A little bit more because it's a little heavier. Enough so you can steer the arc where you need it without fatiguing yourself or compromising sort of that fluid motion through the whole weld bead. Now, if you want, you can just simply levitate your entire body and then slowly drift in the direction of your weld. If you have trouble doing that, take advantage of some nearby edge or set up something to rest your hand against that provides a guide and a reference for you. In this case, I could use, say, the edge of my bench. If I set the weld joint parallel to that, I can use the edge as sort of a track and ride against it to see that weld through. Now, of course, you may not always be able to do that. You might not be able to move your work, or it might be at some strange angle. In that case, you could set up, I don't know, build up something else, some other support structure, clamp some tubing somewhere up at angles or different heights, whatever makes you most comfortable, and use that the same way. Again, sort of just lean on it and it will guide your weld. And when you're just starting out with TIG welding, you'll want to be conscious of just how much weight you're keeping on your torch arm, your torch hand. Even using a guide, you don't want to get into the situation where you run out of space, run out of range of motion, and then have to sort of reorient yourself and pick up again. Once you're set up, do a dry run. Just avoid any jerky moves in your weld. You bet your bottom dollar you'll see where that happened when your weld is finished. Might not always matter, depends what you're doing, but if you're going for a decent looking weld, just try to keep it nice, smooth, and continuous. Not long ago, I picked up 2 sizes of these TIG fingers from Jody over at Weldmonger. I haven't done a lot of work with them yet, but you know what I like maybe even more than the heat protection? It's just the fact that they provide a smooth sliding surface to ride on. Like that motion is silky smooth. In fact, it even lets me put a little bit more weight on, say, the guide or whatever I'm propping up on without adding any resistance to moving the torch and helping me keep my travel speed a lot more consistent. Before these, I used to use an old leather glove, but inevitably it would snag on something and I'd lose it halfway through my weld. Again, I don't do too much these days. That gets so hot and so uncomfortable that I really need these, but for consistent torch motion, again, they're really slick. Okay, so let's bring those 2 things together. On the one hand, we want to keep a consistent torch angle with respect to the work so our heat is going where we want it. On the other hand, we'd like to be set up so we get as consistent a motion as possible for the length of the weld we're trying to do. Now, it probably doesn't take much brain power to see how those 2 sort of compound each other. It's really not that hard to lose sight of where your torch is pointing once you've made your way 8 or 10 inches across a weld joint, especially when you're dealing with the additional panic of getting filler rod in there fast enough. I mean, sometimes my torch ends up completely upside down by the time I get to the other end. So here's what I propose. Do some welding without any filler whatsoever. Just use the torch to run some beads. Concentrate on maintaining a consistent torch angle and doing nice straight runs. Try to keep your weld puddle as consistent in width as possible. So there we're throwing in a little bit of heat control. If your weld bead gets too thin, it means you're either too cold or moving too fast. If it gets too wide, it means you've slowed down or are welding hotter. If you have a foot controller, that'll come in handy. As your part starts to warm up, it'll take less amps to do what you're trying to do. Again, to compensate, you'll need to speed up, pick up your travel speed, or again, if you have an amp controller, lighten up on the current. Oh, and by the way, here's what the difference is between clean material and, well, it's not really dirty, but the mill scale was still on there. You can see the mill scale sort of bubbles up and gets trapped in the weld bead. And here the beads are not super shiny, but very clean. On this end, it's very bubbly. My heat was too low. The amperage setting on the machine was too low, so I had to go really slow, and it really cooked that mill scale. This is, it's more than 1/8, but less than 1/4, 3/16, I guess, 4 or 5 millimeters. This was at 80 amps, and this is 120, I think. Okay, well, I think that's all I've got. That was sure long-winded for all of 2 things I thought I wanted to share. Maybe that was pointless. Perhaps I'm projecting my own insecurities, but I don't think I've seen these particular details get as much love as I think they deserve. So you won't get any better at welding by watching videos. I mean, especially not mine. Fire up your rig and practice, practice, practice. Learning to weld on your own is certainly possible. You're at a bit of a disadvantage not having someone over your shoulder telling you how much of an idiot you are, like my welding instructor did for me. So before you start worrying about dialing in settings or electrodes and cups, flow rate, try putting more thought into your form. All this other stuff is certainly important, but take it from my first-hand experience. If you don't develop good habits early on, they'll be harder to shake later. And if you're not having much luck, try stepping out of yourself, maybe even recording yourself welding. See if that way you notice something different between what you're doing and what you see online. You know, like when you're at the dinner table and everyone's telling you about their day and your autoimmune system kicks in self-defense, and you actually project yourself outside your own skin, watching everyone talking in slow motion from above. Well, do just that, only with your welding. And don't fret, keep at it. Sooner than later, you'll be welding circles around your friends in an airtight cage even Houdini could. Thanks for watching.